The courtroom was unusually warm that day in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but the atmosphere was tense. All eyes were fixed on Judge Mitchell, who barely looked up from his papers as he delivered the verdict. Case dismissed. Just 2 words. Yet they echoed through the room, signaling the end of the trial. In the back, Thomas Green leaned back in his chair, stretching lazily with a smirk spreading across his face. Beside him, Eric Thompson offered a slow, sarcastic clap under his breath, just enough for the surrounding audience to feel the mocking undertone. Neither of the officers appeared concerned. They had been in this dance before. Thomas was broad-shouldered with slicked-back hair and a gaze that could intimidate even the most seasoned rookies. Eric, on the other hand, was leaner and more wiry, with lines etched around his eyes suggesting he hadn't blinked during the testimony. They were seasoned veterans of the system, well acquainted with its rhythm. They knew which lawyers would crumble under pressure, which evidence would conveniently disappear, and how to make a civilian appear unreliable on the stand. Their eyes shifted toward the plaintiff, Marcus Reed, who sat resolute in his seat. He didn't flinch. He maintained a steady gaze ahead, jaw clenched, hands resting calmly in his lap, as if he were engaged in silent prayer. He dressed simply in a dark suit, devoid of any flamboyance, and wore a tie that showed signs of wear. His expression was devoid of emotion, projecting a calmness that seemed almost unnerving to those around him. Eric leaned over and whispered to Thomas, "He thought he could take us down. What a fool." Thomas chuckled lightly. "What's he going to do now? Write a blog post about it?" As they gathered their belongings and stood to leave, the atmosphere felt almost casual to them, as if today were just another Wednesday. Yet Marcus rose slowly, maintaining his composure, not looking beaten but rather focused, as if he was mentally replaying every moment of the trial. Outside the courthouse, cameras were poised, reporters scribbled notes, and local news crews hovered with their microphones. Most of the media ignored Marcus, their headlines already written. Officers cleared in use of force case. He didn't stop to talk. He simply walked past them, exuding an air of calculation rather than defeat. Inside the building, Eric slapped Thomas on the back, grinning. "Let's hit up Joe's barbecue to celebrate. Not every day you embarrass a lawyer in court." Thomas nodded in agreement, laughter spilling from his lips. Yeah, that guy thought he could waltz in here, waving his moral flag, and change the system. Poor guy. But lingering in the same hallway, an older man in a gray coat stood silently, observing the 2 officers as they swaggered away, laughter echoing behind them. Marcus Reed was not angry, not anymore. He was ready. He understood that sometimes the only way to eradicate rot from a system was to infiltrate it from within. Years before he donned the suit, before the courtrooms, and before he became a lawyer, Marcus Reed had also worn a badge. Few people knew that. 15 years ago, he was one of the few African-American officers at the East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office. Back then, he still held onto the belief that good people could reform a broken system. He arrived early, maintained meticulous reports, followed every rule, and never allowed his temper to rise. He thought that by doing things the right way, he would earn respect. However, the real test of his beliefs came on a rainy Thursday night. Off duty and driving home in his old Honda Civic, he was pulled over without warning by 2 patrol cars, their lights flashing ominously behind him. As he stepped out of the vehicle, hands on the steering wheel, he was met by Thomas and Eric, who approached with a menacing air, devoid of any courtesy or introduction. "Step out of the car," Thomas barked. Marcus remained calm, asserting, "I'm law enforcement. My badge is in the glove compartment." But before he could reach for it, Thomas yanked the door open and struck him hard. The chaos unfolded swiftly, with kicks and punches raining down on him. Marcus shouted his badge number repeatedly, but his cries fell on deaf ears. The rain mixed with the blood on the pavement as he fought to protect himself. But it was all in vain. In just minutes, the brutal encounter left him face down, soaked through, with blood trickling from his mouth and ear. They released him only after someone checked his identification and confirmed his story, offering no apologies or formalities, just a terse warning. You didn't see anything, and neither did we. Marcus didn't report the incident. He was young and still believed that he could effect change from within the system. He convinced himself that justice would eventually prevail. 6 months later, he resigned quietly, choosing to return to school. Law school became his refuge, where he burned the midnight oil, learning about a field he once thought had no relevance to someone like him. Years passed, and Marcus transformed into a dedicated attorney, specializing in civil rights and cases of excessive force. He took on the cases that others avoided, often losing yet sometimes coming close to achieving justice. But this time, he wasn't in court to win. He was there to document the truth and expose the officers who continued to walk free. Little did Thomas and Eric know, the game was only just beginning, and sometimes what appears to be a defeat is merely the setup for a greater reckoning. Marcus Reed was not just a victim. He was a man with a past that intertwined deeply with the law enforcement community. 15 years prior, he had proudly worn the badge of an officer in the East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office, one of the few African-American officers in a predominantly white department. Back then, Marcus held a genuine belief that change was possible, that good people could reform a broken system from within. He was diligent, arriving early for shifts, meticulously documenting every report and adhering strictly to the rules. His colleagues often praised him for his integrity, and for a while, it seemed that his efforts were paying off. However, his idealism faced a harsh reality one fateful night. It was a rainy Thursday evening when Marcus, having finished a double shift, decided to stop at a gas station to grab a snack before heading home. As he pulled out of the station in his aging Honda Civic, he noticed flashing lights erupting behind him. Confused and concerned, Marcus immediately pulled over, hands resting on the steering wheel, his training kicking in. He never imagined that the officers approaching his vehicle would be two familiar faces, Thomas Green and Eric Thompson. Initially, Marcus thought that perhaps they were there to check on him, to offer assistance. But as the two men stepped closer, their intentions became clear. No greetings, no explanations, just aggressive commands. "Get out of the vehicle," Thomas barked, his voice filled with authority. "What's the problem here?" Marcus responded calmly, trying to diffuse the situation. "I'm law enforcement. My badge is in the glove compartment." Before he could even unbuckle his seatbelt, the situation escalated. Thomas threw open the door, and without warning, he struck Marcus with a force that sent him reeling. The assault was swift and brutal. Marcus was taken aback, struggling to comprehend that fellow officers would resort to such violence. Despite his training, he found himself overwhelmed, when as Eric joined in, delivering punches and kicks, all while Marcus shouted his badge number, desperately trying to assert his identity and seek some form of recognition. The rain fell heavily, mixing with the humiliation and pain of the moment. Marcus felt the cold pavement beneath him as he tried to shield himself from the onslaught. He was not just fighting for his dignity, he was fighting for his life. The chaos felt surreal as he struggled to breathe, each blow a reminder of the betrayal he faced from those who were supposed to uphold the law. In the background, he could hear laughter, an echo of the disdain his attackers held for him. After what felt like an eternity, The assault ended as abruptly as it had begun. The officers finally relented when dispatch confirmed his identity. They released him, leaving him battered and bleeding on the wet pavement, offering no apologies, only a warning. "You didn't see anything, and neither did we." The words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the power imbalance that existed within the system. In the days that followed, Marcus grappled with the trauma of the incident. He didn't report the assault, believing that silence was the only option. He convinced himself that if he stayed quiet, perhaps things would change eventually. But deep down, the experience shattered his trust in the very institution he had dedicated his life to serving. It was a turning point for him, one that would ultimately lead to his resignation 6 months later. Marcus embarked on a new journey, returning to school with a renewed sense of purpose. He enrolled in law school, attending night classes while working odd jobs to support himself. He immersed himself in the study of law, eager to understand the system from a different perspective. The books he read, filled with legal theories and case studies, illuminated the discrepancies and injustices that pervaded the very system he once believed in. Through his studies, Marcus honed his skills, preparing himself for a future where he could advocate for those who had been wronged. He became increasingly passionate about civil rights and cases of excessive force, driven by the desire to hold those in power accountable. Although he faced setbacks and often lost cases, each defeat only fueled his determination to fight for justice. Years later, as he stood in a courtroom, the echoes of his past converged with his present. He was no longer the vulnerable officer on the ground. He had transformed into a fierce advocate for change, ready to expose the corruption he had once faced. With every step he took, he was prepared to hold those who abused their power accountable, knowing that sometimes the most effective way to dismantle a broken system was to infiltrate it from within. The real conflict began to unfold as Marcus Reed decided to take a stand against the very officers who had once humiliated him. After years of grappling with the trauma of his past, he had transformed his pain into purpose. Now, as a civil rights attorney, he was determined to hold Thomas Green and Eric Thompson accountable for their actions. He knew that bringing them to justice would not only be a personal victory, but also a vital step toward reforming a broken system that had long protected its own. Marcus filed a lawsuit against the two officers for their brutal assault. He understood that the legal battle would be uphill, especially given the culture of silence and complicity within law enforcement. However, he was resolute, armed with the knowledge and skills he had acquired during law school. He meticulously gathered evidence and eyewitness accounts, each piece a testament to his commitment to exposing the truth. He wasn't simply seeking retribution. He wanted to shine a light on the systemic issues that allowed such abuses to persist unchecked. On the day of the trial, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters filled the benches, their notepads ready to capture every moment. As Marcus entered the room, he felt the weight of the eyes upon him. He was determined to remain composed, to show that he was not the defeated victim they once thought he was. The opposing side, represented by a seasoned attorney hired by the police union, was prepared to dismantle Marcus's credibility at every turn. They intended to portray him as a disgruntled former officer, looking for revenge rather than a man seeking justice. During the proceedings, tensions escalated. Thomas and Eric sat at the plaintiff's table, their demeanor arrogant and dismissive. They exchanged glances, confident that the system would favor them as it had in the past. But Marcus was undeterred. He presented his case with clarity and conviction, recounting the events of that fateful night in vivid detail. Each word was laced with the pain and indignation he had carried for years. He described the brutality he endured, the humiliation of being attacked by his own colleagues, and the profound impact it had on his life. As the trial progressed, it became evident that the narrative was shifting. Witnesses began to speak out, some even expressing remorse for their silence in the past. Their testimonies painted a picture of a culture of violence and intimidation within the department. The courtroom atmosphere began to change. Murmurs of disbelief spread among those present as the truth emerged. Marcus's determination to seek justice resonated with many who had witnessed similar abuses but had remained silent out of fear or apathy. However, the opposing counsel was relentless. They attempted to discredit Marcus by highlighting his resignation from the force, arguing that it was indicative of his failure rather than a principled stand against corruption. They painted him as someone who could not handle the pressures of the job, a narrative designed to undermine his credibility. Despite these attacks, Marcus held firm. He knew that the real battle was not just about him. It was about everyone who had suffered at the hands of those sworn to protect them. As the judge deliberated, the tension in the room was palpable. Marcus felt a mix of hope and anxiety. The verdict would determine not just his fate, but also whether the justice system would hold accountable those who wielded power without consequence. He understood that even if the court ruled in favor of the officers, his efforts would not be in vain. He had already begun to expose the cracks in the system, encouraging others to speak out and seek change. But the verdict came as a blow. Case dismissed. Just 2 words echoed in the courtroom, and Marcus felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. He had not expected an easy victory, but the dismissal felt like a personal loss. Yet, as he stood up, he did not let despair take hold. Instead, he resolved to continue his fight, knowing that sometimes the path toward justice is long and fraught with obstacles. As he walked out of the courtroom, journalists clamored for his attention, but he brushed past them. He was not defeated. He was merely recalibrating his strategy. Outside, he noticed a small group of supporters waiting for him, their faces filled with encouragement. Their presence reminded him that the struggle was far from over. It was only the beginning, and he was ready to keep fighting, determined to change the narrative and bring about real transformation from within the system. After the courtroom defeat, Marcus Reed felt a surge of determination that ignited a fire within him. He realized that the battle against Thomas Green and Eric Thompson was not over. In fact, it had only just begun. Instead of retreating into despair, he decided to take a different approach. He would infiltrate the system that had once betrayed him, not as a powerless victim, but as a force for change. Months passed as Marcus immersed himself deeper into his work. He committed himself to becoming the best advocate for civil rights he could be. He spent countless hours researching police misconduct cases, reviewing internal policies, and networking with other activists and lawyers who shared his vision for reform. Each late night spent poring over legal documents only strengthened his resolve. He was determined to expose the corrupt practices that allowed officers like Thomas and Eric to operate with impunity. Then, a pivotal opportunity arose when Marcus was appointed as the commander of the Internal Affairs Division at the East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office. It was a position he had never imagined he would hold, especially considering his history with the department. But now, he had the power to investigate and hold accountable those who abused their authority. As he stepped into his new role, he was acutely aware that he was stepping into a lion's den, one filled with colleagues who had once scorned him and who would be watching his every move. Marcus entered the precinct with purpose, his demeanor calm and collected. He quickly established himself as a leader who wouldn't tolerate misconduct. The officers were initially indifferent, thinking that Marcus, the former officer turned attorney, would be easy to intimidate. However, he maintained a cool detachment, carefully observing the dynamics of the department. He knew that the most dangerous thing he could do was to appear weak or uncertain. As days turned into weeks, Marcus began to gather intelligence on the very officers he had once called colleagues. He reviewed case files, analyzed reports, and interviewed staff members. He learned of several incidents that had been swept under the rug, cases where excessive force had been used, and complaints that had mysteriously vanished. The deeper he dug, the more he uncovered, a pattern of behavior that pointed directly back to Thomas and Eric, among others. Marcus's presence began to disrupt the status quo. He instituted new policies that emphasized accountability and transparency, much to the chagrin of many seasoned officers. Rumors began to circulate within the precinct about his determination, and the atmosphere shifted. Officers who once laughed at his attempts to bring change now whispered in corners, unsure of how to respond to the new commander who was unafraid to challenge long-standing practices. Thomas and Eric, in particular, felt the pressure mounting. They had grown accustomed to operating in a culture of fear and silence, but now Marcus was shining a light on their actions. They dismissed him, believing he was merely a temporary obstacle who would soon back down. However, Marcus was patient, biding his time, waiting for the moment when he could strike effectively. One day, during a routine briefing, Marcus presented evidence of misconduct that included discrepancies in case reports linked to Thomas and Eric. As he laid out the facts, he could feel the tension in the room rise. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, and for the first time, there was a palpable sense of concern among them. Marcus's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the rising anxiety of those who had thrived on the unspoken code of silence. "Let me be clear," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I am not here to make friends. I am here to clean house. The behavior that has been tolerated in this department will not stand under my watch." The impact of his words was immediate. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others looked down, avoiding eye contact. Marcus's determination had begun to fracture the facade of invincibility that had protected Thomas and Eric for so long. He realized that the fear they had instilled in others was beginning to wane, replaced by the realization that accountability was finally and unlikely at hand. As he continued his investigations, Marcus remained focused on his mission. He was not just fighting for his own justice, he was fighting for every individual who had suffered due to the corruption that had festered within the department. With each passing day, he felt more empowered, more resolute in his quest for change. He was no longer the victim. He was the architect of a new system, one built on integrity, accountability, and the unwavering belief that justice could prevail. As he moved forward, Marcus knew the road ahead would be challenging. There would be resistance, and the fight would not be easy. But he was prepared to face whatever came his way, knowing that this time he was not alone. With each step he took, he was not just reclaiming his past, he was reshaping the future for countless others, proving that sometimes the most powerful change comes from within. As Marcus Reed settled into his role as the commander of internal affairs, he faced a pivotal challenge: the need to confront Thomas Green and Eric Thompson directly. The tension in the precinct was palpable, with many officers caught between their loyalty to their colleagues and the fear of the changes Marcus was implementing. He knew that exposing the corrupt practices of the past would not only require solid evidence, but also a strategic approach to ensure that his efforts would not backfire. Marcus had been gathering information for weeks, meticulously compiling a dossier that detailed numerous incidents of misconduct linked to Thomas and Eric. He had uncovered a troubling pattern. Several cases of excessive force had been closed prematurely, and complaints from civilians had mysteriously vanished, likely due to the influence of the two officers. With each piece of evidence he collected, his resolve strengthened. He was determined to bring accountability to a department that had long turned a blind eye to such issues. One morning, during a departmental briefing, Marcus decided it was time to present his findings. He gathered all the officers in the main conference room, the air thick with anticipation. As he stood before them, he could feel the weight of their scrutiny, especially from Thomas and Eric, who sat at the front with an air of defiance. They believed their past immunity would shield them once again. "Thank you all for being here," Marcus began, his voice steady and authoritative. "Today I want to address some serious concerns regarding our operational integrity and accountability. I've been reviewing case files and reports, and what I've found is deeply troubling." He began to lay out the evidence, projecting documents onto a screen for everyone to see. The room fell silent as he detailed specific cases of misconduct involving Thomas and Eric. He highlighted discrepancies in reports, questionable use of force, and the absence of proper documentation in cases where civilians had been harmed. As each piece of evidence was presented, murmurs spread through the room. The atmosphere shifted from one of casual indifference to palpable tension. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, some visibly shaken by the severity of the allegations being made against their colleagues. Marcus could see Thomas's expression harden as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Let me be clear," Marcus continued, his eyes locking onto Thomas and Eric. "I am not here to play favorites or protect anyone. This department will be held to the highest standards of accountability. We cannot allow a culture of silence to persist any longer." At that moment, Thomas stood up, his face flushed with anger. "This is a witch hunt, Marcus. You're just trying to ruin us because of your personal vendetta." His voice echoed through the room, filled with indignation. Marcus remained calm, refusing to rise to the provocation. "This isn't personal. This is about justice," he replied, his tone unwavering. "It's about protecting our community and ensuring that every officer upholds the law, including you." As the tension crackled in the air, Marcus continued to present his findings, detailing the systemic issues that had allowed Thomas and Eric to operate without accountability for so long. He emphasized the importance of integrity and transparency, urging his fellow officers to stand together against misconduct. After the presentation, Marcus opened the floor for discussion. Some officers expressed their support for the changes he was advocating, while others remained skeptical, still clinging to the old ways. However, the cracks in the culture of silence were beginning to show. A younger officer, inspired by Marcus's courage, stepped forward to share his own experiences of witnessing misconduct. His voice trembled, but he spoke truthfully about the fear that had kept him silent for too long. Marcus felt a surge of hope. The tide was turning, and he realized that more officers were willing to speak out. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for, a sign that the reform he envisioned was within reach. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Thomas and Eric intensified. With each passing day, more officers came forward, sharing their stories and corroborating the evidence against their colleagues. The Internal Affairs Division began to function as Marcus had envisioned, transforming from a fear-driven entity into a beacon of accountability. As the pressure mounted, Thomas and Eric found themselves increasingly isolated. Their bravado began to fade as they realized that the support they once had was crumbling beneath them. Marcus had successfully shifted the narrative, turning the department's culture toward one of accountability rather than complicity. Finally, the day arrived when Marcus was ready to present his formal findings to the sheriff's office. With a comprehensive report detailing the misconduct of Thomas and Eric, along with testimonies from fellow officers, he felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. This was a defining moment, not just for him, but for the entire department. When Marcus entered the sheriff's office, he was met with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. He presented his evidence with conviction, detailing the systemic failures that had allowed Thomas and Eric to operate without consequence for so long. The room fell silent as he concluded, leaving the sheriff and his staff to digest the gravity of the situation. "Today we have the opportunity to change our department for the better," Marcus said, his voice resonating with determination. "We can hold those accountable who have betrayed the trust of our community. It's time to make a stand for what is right." As he left the sheriff's office, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He understood that the fight was far from over, but he was resolute in his commitment to bringing about real change. With each step he took, he was not only reclaiming his own narrative, but also paving the way for a future where justice and accountability would prevail. In the weeks that followed Marcus Reed's pivotal presentation to the sheriff's office, the atmosphere within the department shifted dramatically. The investigation into the misconduct of Thomas Green and Eric Thompson gained momentum, fueled by the testimonies of fellow officers who had once remained silent. As more evidence came to light, it became increasingly clear that the culture of impunity that had long existed within the department was beginning to unravel. The department's Internal Affairs Division, once viewed with suspicion, now stood as a symbol of accountability and integrity. Officers who had previously been hesitant to speak up began to find their voices, emboldened by Marcus's leadership and the support of their peers. The tide had turned, and the once prevailing atmosphere of fear was gradually replaced by a commitment to transparency and justice. As the investigation progressed, the sheriff's office announced that Thomas and Eric would face disciplinary hearings. The news sent shockwaves through the precinct. For the first time in years, officers were confronted with the reality that their actions could have consequences. Whispers of both apprehension and support echoed through the hallways, as many began to realize that the changes Marcus had implemented were not just words, but a genuine movement toward reform. On the day of the hearing, the courthouse was packed with officers, community members, and reporters eager to witness the proceedings. Marcus sat in the front row, his heart pounding with anticipation. This was not merely a moment of vindication for him. It was a chance for the community to see justice served and for the department to begin healing from its troubled past. As the hearing commenced, the atmosphere was tense. Thomas and Eric, flanked by their legal counsel, appeared confident. But the cracks in their facade were evident. Marcus knew that this was the moment he had been fighting for, a chance to hold them accountable for their actions and to send a message that misconduct would no longer be tolerated. The testimonies presented during the hearing were powerful. Officers spoke candidly about the culture of silence that had pervaded the department, detailing how fear had kept them from reporting misconduct. Community members shared their experiences of being mistreated by officers who had abused their power. Each account added weight to the case against Thomas and Eric, painting a vivid picture of the harm caused by their actions. As the proceedings continued, Marcus felt a sense of hope blossoming within him. The once untouchable officers were now facing the consequences of their actions, and the community was rallying behind the call for justice. The hearing became a turning point, not just for Marcus, but for the entire department and the community it served. When the time came for the judge to deliver a verdict, the room fell silent. Marcus held his breath, knowing that the outcome would have lasting implications. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies presented, I find that Officers Green and Thompson are guilty of the charges against them. They will be terminated from their positions and will face further legal consequences for their actions. Cheers erupted from the crowd, a mixture of relief and triumph. Marcus felt tears of joy welling up in his eyes. This was not just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had been silenced and marginalized. It was a testament to the power of courage and perseverance in the face of adversity. As the dust settled in the aftermath of the hearing, Marcus took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. He understood that the fight for justice was ongoing and that real change required continuous effort. While this victory was significant, he knew that many challenges lay ahead. In the weeks following the verdict, Marcus dedicated himself to fostering a new culture within the department, one that prioritized accountability, respect, and community engagement. He implemented training programs focused on ethics and community relations, ensuring that officers understood the importance of their roles as protectors of the community. Marcus also became a mentor to younger officers, encouraging them to speak out against misconduct and to uphold the values of integrity and justice. He understood that change would not happen overnight, but he was committed to nurturing a new generation of officers who would carry the torch of accountability forward. As he walked through the precinct, he felt a sense of purpose. The scars of the past remained, but they served as reminders of the importance of vigilance and the necessity of perseverance. Marcus knew that the fight for justice was a continuous journey, one that required the courage to speak out, the strength to stand firm, and the willingness to create a better future. In the end, Marcus Reed's story was not just about seeking revenge or retribution. It was about transforming pain into purpose and using his experiences to catalyze change. He had learned that true justice is not merely about punishment, but about accountability, understanding, and growth. His journey demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person can make a difference, and that sometimes the most powerful change begins with a single voice daring to speak out.